Hi there, good afternoon. As a brief introduction, this is Jamie Browne, the Managing Director of the Corporate Governance Division of the Leonid Group. However, on a day-to-day basis, my focus has always been the ethics and trade compliance space, which I've been doing for almost a decade. And today, I'm joined by Andrew McBride, the previous Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Albemarle, the global specialty chemicals company. Today, we're going to discuss in some detail his journey at Albemarle, dealing with the FCPA investigation, as well as looking at future trends we're seeing in the compliance and governance space. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me today, and it's a pleasure to see you as always.
Pleasure to be here, Jamie. Thank you.
If you could start, please, by introducing yourself, how we came across each other, and what your remit was when you joined Albemarle in 2018.
Sure. So I started my professional career at a UK Magic Circle law firm. Started out as a competition antitrust lawyer, spending time in London and Brussels. Mm-hmm. I then moved in-house to BP, initially in London, but then moved out to Chicago to take on additional US antitrust experience. And that really set a recurring theme, I think, through my career of where there was an opportunity to take on additional areas of compliance responsibility, to season it with both hands. And so with that, I did then move to BHP, the world's largest mining company, for global responsibility for competition and antitrust, originally in The Hague and London, but then eventually moved down to Melbourne, where I assumed broader responsibilities for as Associate General Counsel for Compliance, including corruption and sanctions. I also served as acting chief compliance officer during the back end of BHP's SEC FCPA investigation. That investigation related to gifts and hospitality at the Beijing Olympics. Before leaving BHP, my wife and I decided that we would move back to the US, which meant for me a green card. And hanging out in California, spending some quality time with the family by the beach, but also taking the dreaded California State Bar exam. And it was about that time that I met you, Jamie. I was just starting to dip my toe back into the recruitment scene.
That was, I can't believe that was 6-7 years
That's
ago.
right. Yeah, about seven years ago. And, with that green card imminent, I put my cap light on, so to speak, to say that I was ready for hire. And I didn't think it would be in natural resources, but then I noticed an Albemarle role being advertised. And this was the first time that the company was advertising for a full-time chief compliance officer. And, to cut a long story short, I was offered the position. Mm-hmm. And through that was negotiating not only the pay terms with the company, but also some of the key structural aspects of how that new chief compliance officer position would engage with the chief administrative officer, who was going to be my manager, also served as the general counsel, and also the board. And I remember you being a big help in those, supporting me in those discussions. And just to close the picture, so I then joined Albemarle in February of 2018, and we made the move to Charlotte, North Carolina. So Albemarle is a Fortune 500 company. As you mentioned, it's in the specialty chemicals sector. Amongst other things, it's the world's largest lithium producer. It also produces bromine, which is a flame retardant for electrical devices like mobile phones. And catalysts that are used in oil refineries.
I think, especially as it was the first time they've hired this type of position, it's so important to make sure all expectations are aligned.
That's right.
So worth going through the extra step at that time, rather than starting in a role and realizing that expectations are way off.
Yeah.
But you had a pretty eventful beginning to your time at Albemarle.
I did, just a little, yes. So I started on a Monday, and on the Friday, we were having the very first meetings with the DOJ and the SEC self-reporting bribery relating to activities in its refining catalyst business. Fortunately, I knew already that was going to happen. I walked into the role eyes wide open because the General Counsel had told me that this was going to be happening. And I'll be honest, I wasn't entirely surprised given some of the questions that were being asked of me during the interview process. So to dig a little deeper into the investigation fact pattern, it was related to a conspiracy to pay bribes to government officials to obtain and retain chemical catalyst business with state-owned oil refineries in Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. And then the SEC investigation also focused on third-party control failures in additional countries, including China and the UAE. The time frame of the conduct in question was between 2009 to 2017. And as it started in February of 2018, the investigation all told took 5.5 years, during which time I was tasked with building a brand new ethics and compliance program and a new team, which we'll talk about, all under the shadow of this investigation.
And what were when you started on that journey, what were you feeling about the opportunity, the challenge of what you were stepping into?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was daunting but exciting, but it was also something that I'd had experience before, whether with antitrust investigations or with the SEC investigation while at BHP that I mentioned earlier. And so it was a case of kind of utilizing that experience with program build, and really kind of getting to grips with the company and its risk profile, and then starting to sketch out a long-term improvement plan.
And how did the FCPA investigation play out?
Yeah, so to cut a very long story short, in September of 2023, it was announced by the DOJ it entered into a non-prosecution agreement with Albemarle. We also had a cease and desist order with the SEC. With the DOJ, this was the first MPA in 5 years, and no corporate monitor was appointed. And as part of the resolution, Albemarle paid a penalty of approximately $218 million. That penalty represented a 45% or $81 million reduction of the bottom line of the US sentencing guidelines. And that discount was in recognition of our cooperation with the investigation, the remediation measures to address root cause around the investigation, and the broader enhancements to our compliance program. To date, it's the largest percentage penalty reduction. And so, very satisfied with the outcome.
And out of curiosity, I appreciate it's very difficult at the beginning to know where this journey would go, but how did that outcome compare to maybe what you thought when you initially started on that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I probably wasn't thinking in terms of numbers. I was focused on building the right program for the company in line with its core values, which were introduced in the same month in February of 2018. I will say that for me, it was important that I built a program and was able to demonstrate a working program such that the company did not need a corporate monitor. So I think, if anything, the biggest driver was not having a corporate monitor.
Okay, great. I mean, it sounds like a lot of work. I assume you didn't do all of that by yourself. Can you talk a little bit about the team that you built at Albemarle?
Absolutely. So at BHP, I'd had the opportunity to restructure an existing team, but this was the first time where I was given the mandate to build a brand new team from scratch, which is exciting and daunting at the same time. And to be fair to the company, the Chief Administrative Officer, General Counsel, encouraged me to spend 2 to 3 months really getting to understand the company, both in terms of the risk profile and the existing state of the compliance program as it then was. And so back in May of 2018, I went back to the CAO with my plan, which included resources. And I mean, I was quite methodical in my approach. And so, firstly, thinking very carefully about structure. So, obviously, in the run up to my appointment, I had spent a lot of time talking with the company about the structure of my relationship with the CAO, the leadership team, and the board. But now it was about filling out the structure beneath me and how that would work vis-a-vis me. So first and foremost, compliance was going to be independent of the legal department.
Okay.
That meant that it was important that we built our own internal brand. All the compliance managers would report directly to me. Secondly, on accountabilities, the company was of a modest size, spread thinly across the globe. And so for me, regional presence was very important to make compliance accessible. So I appointed regional compliance managers in North America, South America, Europe, China, and Southeast Asia. And also, in addition to their regional responsibilities, just because of where they were based, they then had a natural alignment to one particular business unit. So, for example, the compliance manager in Chile obviously was spending a lot of time with our lithium leadership team, both locally and at the global level, just because all of the activity in Chile for Albemarle was related to lithium.
Yep.
And then finally, substantive accountability. So each of the members of the team would have, based on their interest or what I encouraged them to get involved with, an area of substantive accountability. So in Chile, our compliance manager was doing a lot of work around community engagement. And so she became a leader within the group on how we were engaging on community engagement issues and the anti-corruption issues that come with that.
Yep.
Our compliance manager in Singapore had day-to-day responsibility for our gifts and hospitality, travel and expenses compliance program. And then third, competences. So making sure that the team wasn't focused on one particular area of compliance activity. Okay. I wanted to make sure that the team had a holistic mix of experience and skills. And that extended not just to the compliance managers, but also the broader support team. So those with experience managing policies, compliance systems, and also a data analyst who was supporting me with our data analytics program. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, team fit. I mean, just making sure that whoever I was recruiting was going to be, the right fit for the team. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
It's, the team fit part obviously is so important, but also can be really difficult to almost screen during an interview process. And for us, when we're working with clients, the focus needs to be as much about the soft skills that are required and the personality that we're looking for, as well as the technical ability. And that's not just within a team, but also in compliance. It's so much about building trust with stakeholders and getting buy-in from different parts of the business, that if you don't have that ability to build relationships, you can know everything on paper technically, but it will be very hard to implement and get policies properly embedded in the organization. So really important.
No, completely agree. So when I left Albemarle early this year, the compliance team had grown to 12, including me. I'm really proud of what we all achieved together. And in fact, in May of this year, really pleased to see the company being awarded Compliance Program of the Year by Compliance Week. It's a real testament to the work of the ethics and compliance team.
I appreciate a routine effort there, but of course, congratulations to you. I know you put a lot of work in there, and it's always good to get to be recognised for that. But
thank you
for that. But when you were building that team, designing that team, and hiring for that team, what challenges did you face on that journey?
Yeah, I mean, in those early days, it felt very much like a startup, and so we were only at the beginning of our journey of building the program, but I was hiring people to help me build that program and then ultimately execute. And so that necessarily means a bit of flexibility in things like role descriptions, because
Yep.
you don't quite know where things are going to ultimately end up with the fully built out program. What I did notice during my hiring, that there are a lot of applicants, particularly those coming from larger companies, that had experience only in perhaps one or two areas of compliance manager activity, maybe investigations or due diligence or training. I really I was more interested in candidates who have broader experience as a compliance manager, who could hit the ground running and could help support me with building that program. The other kind of point was, we had to accept that the team was being built under the shadow of an FCPA investigation. So for me, the art of writing clearly and maintaining good documentation, whether it be policies or a due diligence or investigation report, was critically important to me. And so to address that, I found it a really helpful exercise to give final round candidates a hypothetical situation and then to ask them to write me a report within a 24-hour period. And by seeing their quality of their writing, it really helped me identify the strongest candidate.
Yeah, it's interesting. A few points that stood out there. I appreciate as well when we work with clients and we're looking, what you needed was people that would be able to come in, roll up their sleeves, and get involved.
Yes.
Not afraid to get their hands dirty a little bit and willing to do a bit of everything, because it would be different every day. For some candidates, some people, that would be terrifying.
Yes.
They've been in large companies where everything has structure and rigidity. They have
Yep.
their niche that they're brilliant at and they're relied upon for. But the idea of touching everything, covering everything, and going in where things can be feeling chaotic at times, that could be terrifying.
No, I mean,
it's so exciting.
we were very, very transparent with candidates that there was going to be times where there would be some super cool policy development work, but then there would be other times where it would be rolling up the sleeves and getting into the detail of a particular activity. And it was very interesting to see how candidates kind of reacted to that. I would say then, just kind of moving further along the timeline, once the team was fully built, I then faced a new challenge. And it goes back to this issue of team fit. I was very protective of the team and the great collaborative team spirit that we had built together. And so when hiring new team members, the most important consideration was team fit. I mean, there were a couple of instances where I actually delayed hiring because I wasn't sure that I had found the right person for the team. It was that important to me.
I can attest that it was very important to you. It wasn't, but I also interacted with some of the team around the world, and I could really understand and see that team fit that you built and the sort of real collaborative nature between team members. So a really important attribute. You discussed earlier about the global nature of a company like Albemarle and how you had to build a program to reflect that. What do you see as the benefits or the drawbacks to centralizing a compliance team versus building out an international team?
Yeah, I mean, I think before getting into the advantages and disadvantages, I mean, a compliance officer sometimes might not have a choice. So if they've only got one or two people in their team, I mean, that might militate in favor of it being centralized, maybe. Now, if the team is bigger, like Albemarle, that ability to embed compliance officers in different regions based on perceived areas of risk is really quite compelling. Compliance then is not an anonymous function. It's a person that an employee would bump into at the water cooler. Those interactions are really priceless. But if the team is bigger, then that still means that perhaps you need a more of a regional management structure to alleviate the burden on the chief compliance officer. But then equally, if your volume of investigations or due diligence is growing significantly, then that might lend itself to that particular aspect being centralized. Certainly at BHP, as I was leaving BHP, we were exploring the possibility of setting up a centralized investigation function, which ultimately happened. If you are building that global team, the key then is cohesion. I felt that the global ethics compliance team at Albemarle, we were one of the closest knit functions within the company, even though we were spread out globally. I mean, and that didn't just happen. We had to really work at it. So for me, that meant weekly meetings with my compliance directors. We would have each member of the team would send out a short bullet point weekly summary of what they were getting involved with. And it would also include personal notes about what's going on in their personal lives to kind of generate that team spirit. We would encourage the compliance managers to be picking up the phone to each other. We didn't just have the upward reporting cycle. If there were questions that compliance managers had, new situations that they were dealing with, then they would pick up the phone to their peers. We would have fortnightly virtual team meetings where we would have an agenda and we would walk through all of the issues of the day. And then we would get together on an annual basis for team building and for addressing bigger ticket items. And then one of my favorite activities, every couple of weeks, as we'll talk about, my area of responsibility grew to include risk and insurance and audit for a time. And I would get all of those groups together every couple of weeks, and it would be an opportunity to talk about a core values topic. It could be a safety issue. It could be a mental health issue topic. And so it really wasn't work per se. It was just talking about issues that resonated with members of the team. And through that, it allowed people to kind of really get to know each other on a personal level as well as on a professional level.
Great, thank you. And I guess another topic to look at, which I know is an area that you're always interested to discuss as well, whether compliance functions should or need to be staffed by lawyers. What are your thoughts on this, and what skills do you look for when hiring for your team?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm really passionate about. But it really starts with accountabilities. So as I mentioned at the outset, Albemarle compliance was separate to the legal department. So as such, it was not the responsibility of compliance to advise on the law. If we needed legal advice, we would get that from the legal department or from outside counsel. Our job in compliance was to take that legal guidance and create an accessible code of conduct and the supporting policies and the training materials. We also had to partner with HR to conduct investigations, with finance and IT to conduct transaction monitoring and other types of analytics. As part of the FCPA investigation, we spent a huge amount of time collaborating with other functions like sales and procurement, really to understand their processes. And across all elements of the compliance program, I needed data and I needed analytics capability. So there's no way that could be done just by lawyers. At Albemarle, we had a mix of former chief compliance officers and other compliance managers, forensic accountants, auditors, procurement managers, data analysts, and yes, we also had some lawyers on the team. But first and foremost, they were compliance managers who happened to have legal experience. It's an important distinction. So my resourcing requirements were driven by the company's risk profile and the compliance program that we built. It meant that my job specification for a compliance manager in Europe would be subtly different to that in Asia. So that was the situation at Albemarle. I think for compliance departments that sit within a legal department, I don't think that the analysis is too different. Just because they're part of the legal department does not mean that compliance needs to be staffed wholly by lawyers.
Makes sense. And I think from what I see and what I hear when speaking to companies all around the world, maybe 10 years ago when compliance was seen as a lot more of a through the lens of FCPA almost exclusively, and it was a legal compliance area. Yeah, there were a lot more lawyers that were required to deal with that. But as we're going to touch upon as, a little bit more detail as well, compliance now is so much broader. It can cover so many more topics, and as you say, that can't all be done by lawyers. Not if you want to do it as effectively as you can do. And the other
Yeah,
point as well is, I think compliance at times needs to almost be the bridge between legal and the business. And it needs to translate what is complex regulatory information into language that will be understood by those in the business. And the compliance
that's
team
right.
has a major part to play in that.
Yeah,
Lawyers can do that, of course, but not exclusively.
yeah,
Always is what we
yeah.
see.
Agreed.
I'll always recommend to my clients, if they give me a job description for a role and it's in compliance space and they tell me they want a lawyer, I will always ask them why. And I'll always look to understand a bit more as to if I have someone that has the hands-on experience that I know you need and they don't have the legal background, I would advise against ruling them out. If they have the right personality, soft skills, and experience, then that's the most important.
And I think compliance officers listening to this video, watching this video, are all applauding around the world when they hear you say that, because it is an important responsibility of recruiters to be having that discussion with their hiring companies.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. So, okay. Well, looking then at Albemarle again. So, while the FCPA investigation focused on Albemarle's Catalyst business unit, Albemarle is also the world's largest lithium producer, with presumably all of the sustainability responsibilities that come with that. What did that mean for compliance?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of our scope of accountabilities, fairly on at my time at Albemarle, we assumed the responsibility for conflict minerals reporting. Ultimately, that responsibility then expanded to include human rights more generally, both in relation to our own mining and manufacturing operations, but also within our supply chain. And given that human rights sensitivities associated with battery materials, lithium being one, it was a really important component of became a really important component of our compliance program. And more broadly, business ethics started to become considered more of a central part of our commitment to sustainability. We were part of that broader strategic imperative around sustainability. So when sales teams are asking compliance managers to be part of marketing calls with current or prospective customers to talk positively about our commitment to business ethics and the great work we've done in our compliance program, you know that dynamic has changed and for the better. Suddenly, sales are really beginning to appreciate the value you bring, not just in terms of managing risk for the company, but also in terms of distinguishing ourselves from our competition in the way in which we are conducting our business in line with our corporate values. But then it also comes with heightened accountability. So, like many companies, we had to deal with more and more customer questionnaires, which addressed issues around traditional business ethics, but also human rights. We were having to provide more and more compliance program metrics to support our public reporting on sustainability, whether it be our sustainability report or sustainability indices. And then perhaps one distinguishing factor for Albemarle, the company made the decision to subject itself to a very stringent mining sustainability audit. Starting down in Chile, it was the first lithium company to do that, and only the third mining company globally to put itself through this process, which we passed, and we got the appropriate certification. And one inherent feature of those sustainability audits is demonstrating that your program across all areas of sustainability is not a paper-based program, that it really actually works, which if you think about what the DOJ is saying in relation to things like anti-corruption compliance is very, very similar. So in the context of that sustainability audit, we could not just show that we had a human rights policy or a community engagement policy or a grievance mechanism policy, we had to show how that was being communicated to stakeholders, how a grievance went through the entire life cycle from the intake to the triage to the investigation to the remediation, the involvement of senior management in those discussions. When it came to community relations, how grievance mechanisms and other tools were being communicated to them, right down to showing minutes of meetings and photos of posters up on walls around the local community. And so what I see is a kind of increasing trend, which the sustainability initiative is pushing towards, is that increased accountability, both not just to government, but to NGOs and also to customers, which is meaning that compliance managers are having to ensure that that evidence of compliance is deeper and ready to be provided at any given time.
Yeah, it's a lot of added responsibility there from it. And over your time, Albemarle, as well, I know that the scope of your role and the responsibilities evolved over that time. What impact did that have on the team and your hiring and team development activities?
Yeah, it's really interesting how those accountabilities and responsibilities evolved over that 6-year time frame. So if we take some examples on data privacy, the data privacy program was originally owned by the legal department within Albemarle around the time of the introduction of the EU GDPR. But there was then an appreciation as we got going within compliance that with our experience in developing policies and procedures that were very employee friendly, we were given that responsibility to manage the data privacy program, and one of the compliance managers assumed the role of chief data privacy officer. But then equally, as I was leaving Albemarle, we were reflecting on the significance of there being more and more countries and indeed US states introducing data privacy laws. And we were reflecting on how that was affecting accountabilities within compliance, within the legal department, within IT and HR and other functions.
I mean, the data privacy space is such an interesting area at the moment, and an area that we've always looked at over the past 10 years from a recruitment perspective. And it was interesting when GDPR first was introduced. What I think a lot of companies hoped is that, we can just add this to the roles and responsibilities of a compliance officer, just add it to their plate. But that was not sustainable in the long term. And we needed people that had that real expertise in the space. So suddenly you were getting companies hiring sort of GDPR experts, thinking very narrowly within the EU GDPR regulations. However, as you said there, it's developed over time, new laws coming in different countries and different states. It now needs to be seen as a real privacy framework, as opposed to just subject matter experts in data privacy, and touches upon a lot of the topics that you've been discussing here as well as to how to build that now. But it's an area that has been growing over the years, and to the point now where we've had to, rather than me doing it from a compliance recruitment perspective or our legal team doing data privacy, it needs a fully fledged team focused exclusively on data privacy recruitment, because it's only getting more complex and companies will need to build out these functions.
Yeah, agree. Yeah. And then continuing with the examples, for similar reasons, compliance, we assume responsibility for trade compliance for a period of time. And part of the reason for that was we were really beginning to motor with our policy development. We were doing a lot of collaboration with other functions as well, helping them with their functional governance structures, policies and procedures. And so by having the trade compliance function sit within compliance, as they were building out their new global program, they were able to kind of almost be inculcated in the way in which we were treating the development of the policies, the procedures, the controls, the training materials, and the systems. But it's not a static assessment. So shortly after COVID, the company decided to set up a new integrated supply chain organization. And we felt that given the accountabilities of that supply chain team, that the trade compliance team would fit better then within supply chain in terms of the execution of the program and the policies that they had then built.
The trade compliance space is a really interesting space as well. So when I started doing compliance recruitment 10 years ago, it was 90% of it was ethics and compliance recruitment, maybe 10%, 20% was trade compliance. Now it's almost 50-50 split between trade compliance and ethics and compliance. I think what's happened is so many companies that didn't think they would need to have that in-house expertise and thought they'd be able to rely on external consulting firms or external counsel have realized that the direction this is going in and need in-house expertise that can get to know the company and be there over the long term, which is why we're seeing such a growth in this space.
Yeah. And so what you were alluding to, which I was saying, I mean, the key here is to be dynamic and flexible. So, not doctrinal, that something has to be within a particular department, based on the current risk environment for the company and maybe changes in company structure, whether just reorganization or M&A, does that mean that a different structure is needed? What really works best for the company at that moment? So, more broadly in terms of my accountabilities, I then took on the broader role of Chief Risk Officer in 2022. And with your help, Jamie, I recruited a Vice President of Risk to assist with that. But we didn't have the budget to kind of build out a parallel risk team along with the compliance team. And so because of that, we encouraged the regional compliance managers to get involved in the enterprise risk management process at that local level. It was really important for me in terms of developing the team that they became holistic risk and compliance professionals. And I think that they found it really interesting to be part of those broader strategy and risk discussions that sometimes went way beyond the traditional areas of ethical compliance or into commercial risk or operational risk. And I think that the team felt quite empowered with getting involved with that.
I think it's a really important part of managing a team as well, is not just thinking about, okay, how can we move this person up the career ladder, but how can we broaden their scope of responsibilities? How can I make sure that they're not bored with what they do, that they're kept on their toes, they're seeing new areas, they're getting new experiences. So it's not just about vertical growth in the company, but also that sort of horizontal and looking at the scope of the role. So really interesting to it. And how do you see the management of legal compliance risk evolving going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak for hours on this, so I'll condense it into a couple of minutes.
Do another separate podcast purely on this.
I know, right? I mean, it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot. So, and it's a subject that really fascinates me because not least, I mean, there's some pretty significant changes going on right now. Mm-hmm. I think in order to look forward about what may happen, you have to look back at the evolution of legal and compliance within companies. And so, if you start way back when, health, safety, and environmental compliance has perhaps been around the longest. We've had those laws in place for many, many years, and by extension, then HSE teams have been in place and well established for years. Then moving to the early 2000s, financial reporting and controls took increased prominence, not least with Sarbanes-Oxley, and then subsequently with Dodd-Frank. That led to more dedicated roles within finance and within legal in terms of the financial regulatory reporting responsibilities. Even within that kind of area of reporting, the accountabilities have recently expanded associated with sustainability reporting. And so companies are having to think about what that means in terms of the management of the reporting and then the associated responsibility for controls. Around about the same time, you had business ethics as a discipline really beginning to pick up. So with increased enforcement with anti-corruption, antitrust and sanctions, the corporate compliance function and the role of the chief compliance officer really began to take hold. In the mid-teens, we had data privacy, as we were discussing with the introduction of the GDPR, with many compliance functions initially taking responsibility for that. But as we alluded to earlier, that framework for data privacy, the responsibilities has got deeper with more countries and more US states introducing data privacy laws. It's become more complex and it's become broader, so that you've got things like cybersecurity, state secrets, and now the appropriate use of artificial intelligence. And so it's going to be interesting to see as to whether and where we started with data privacy is going to initially evolve into a new and more fully formed area of so-called information compliance, and whether data privacy professionals are going to kick up and step up to take on those broader responsibilities, given their skill sets with managing that subset of personal data. And then finally, we have the increasing treatment of human rights as a legal compliance issue. Perhaps it started with conflict minerals reporting in the US and then the EU, but now it's expanded to include broader human rights due diligence of company operations and in the supply chain, and then associated forced labor enforcement like the UFLPA with the US Customs and Border Protection. I mean, this is becoming its own discrete area of human rights or perhaps social compliance.
Yeah, I mean, even for us, we last year implemented a team focused exclusively on human rights and ESG recruitment, initially in light of the upcoming due diligence laws that were happening in Germany and in the EU. And it's interesting to see how companies are reacting to it. Some are definitely seeing it through a reporting, more operational lens, and that is linked more to supply chain. Others, as you touched on there, see it as more of an overarching human rights framework, more typically within the legal and compliance space. And I think our company's purely looking at it as a way to adhere to the law, the new laws that are coming in, or are they using this as a much broader function that is not just about adherence of the law, but how they think they need to behave morally and ethically as an organization from a human rights perspective. So it's a really interesting space.
Yeah. And so if we kind of sum that up, we've now got increasingly discrete areas of compliance, right? So HSE, reporting, business ethics, information compliance, and then social compliance. And in the past, as we've been talking about over the past 20, 30 minutes, business ethics teams may have assumed responsibility for some of these, but the complexity in each of these areas might mean that they need their own leadership structures. We're already starting to hear kind of roles such as a chief AI officer as an example. But even if they're separate, they have to be much more joined up. So if we take third-party risk management as an example, with that now necessarily involves business ethics for corruption, social compliance for human rights, HSE for environmental due diligence, which is a requirement of the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and then information compliance for cybersecurity diligence. And so that coordination piece is becoming super important, particularly if you've got discrete teams that have that accountability in each of those areas. And I think it's whether the chief compliance officer is ultimately responsible for some or all of those, at a minimum, they have to be part of that conversation and perhaps even leading that conversation to ensure that it is all joined up.
I think that's the potential challenge is if these functions become too distinct, too separate from each other. And because so much of this can work together, so many of these areas could work together really well. And I think that's something that there is a risk with certain companies that, as we've seen, is that the privacy function is just not talking to the compliance function or the legal function, even though a lot of those roles and responsibilities will overlap, and duplications happening or inefficiencies happening through that route. So as you say, chief compliance officers, if they're not leading these different functions, need to make sure that they are in constant communication, and not just them, but their teams are in constant communication as well.
Yeah.
But a very interesting area. And maybe in a few years' time, Andrew, we can do another one of these and look back at what we discussed here and compare to where things are, and then do another look into the future.
Yeah.
But I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, and thank you for just sharing some of your journey, but also your perspectives of what you've done so far, but also what you think will be happening in the future. I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll be very curious to keep in touch on these points.
Yeah. No, pleasure, Jamie. Thanks very much for the opportunity.